like to now introduce our first speaker, Guillermo, who is the CEO of Vercel. Guillermo got into programming at a very young age and has a fascinating story about some of the key projects that he's been involved in. From Next.js, Hyper.app, the Electron-based terminal app, and MooTools. So due to poor connectivity right now, what we'll be doing is we'll be playing a video recording of Guillermo's talk, which he just finished, and he's very much here and part of the session, and he will be taking your questions at the end of the session. So great, I'm going to start the recording now, and then we will hand it over to Guillermo to address questions.
Hello everyone at Breakpoint. This is Guillermo Rauch. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vercel. And today I'm here to talk to you about some topic that's really dear to my heart. And the topic is all about URLs. I've had a sort of an unhealthy obsession with URLs for a few years now. And I think it's one of the most powerful ways of communicating, and not only between ourselves, but also between systems on the internet. So today I'm going to talk about how there's one type of URL specifically, what I call the deploy URL, that I think will have a tremendous amount of impact in the way we do testing, in the way we do QA, in the way we collaborate with each other while we work on projects. And this deploy URL is sort of something you get for any sort of project that you work on by using our platform, Vercel. And you might or might not use our open source framework, Next.js, but any sort of front-end focused technology that you can think of, you can deploy with that deploy URL. And with that URL, you can sort of integrate into a variety of systems. So when you think about how BrowserStack simulates browsers and performs tests, you can think about having BrowserStack go after that deploy URL as opposed to going after a canonical staging server. So before I get into the details of my presentation, let me peel back a few layers and tell you a little bit more about how this idea has come to be and our history so far. So about myself a little bit, my name is Guillermo Rauch. I've been involved with a series of very successful tech projects and startups over the years. Either as a co-founder, as an investor, or as a advisor, or just contributing my time and effort. But specifically, my career is all about open source and JavaScript, and it sort of started many years ago with the MooTools framework. I became a Node.js core contributor later on. I started a project called Socket.io, later a project called Mongoose. And then it sort of became interested in startups. And actually, this startup, CloudUp, that I sold to WordPress in 2013, one of the key things was it made it really, really easy to get a URL for any file or video or image or anything you wanted to share. You could get a URL very quickly. So later on, I started Vercel with this idea of taking that concept of giving a URL to every single thing that we do, but applied to the development process and the front-end development workflow. So when you think about Vercel, one of the key things for me is that we're a mission-driven company that's all about publishing and building wonderful things. So way back in 2016, started some prototypes around what it would look like to enable developers to deploy very, very easily. Later on in 2017, we started the Next.js framework, with this idea of making it super easy for anybody to start up with React and create any project with React. And some innovative concepts in there like no configuration whatsoever, supporting for server-side rendering, supporting for file system-based routing. Later in 2018, we started really seriously starting to conceive, design, and execute on a very scalable deployment platform for Next.js and projects like it. One of the key things here is as well this theme of deploying with no configuration whatsoever, scaling static hosting to a global edge network, meaning that when you deploy a static website, it gets replicated automatically everywhere in the world, and giving the developer the capability to deploy serverless functions. And something really interesting that has happened so far is that Next.js has grown so much that it drove the attention of Google, who now contribute to the framework directly. Next.js evolved to become a hybrid of static site generation and server-side rendering, among many other things. But one of the things that has sort of been the foundation of all this evolution is that the software engineering world is changing quite dramatically. So beyond the specific trends like React and Next.js and deployment and so on, we've noticed a pretty dramatic shift. So one of the things we notice is that the world is moving away from serverless away from servers into serverless infrastructure. We're moving away from the data center to the edge. So when you start up a project today, you don't think about putting it in one specific location. You think about reaching everybody in the globe and putting the content right where a visitor is, similar to how Netflix puts videos right next to your home at your ISP. You can put also your applications and content. Another interesting thing has been witnessing the shift from templates into components. So if you're familiar with front-end development, you've noticed that there's a very dramatic shift toward design systems and structuring components as reusable blocks that anybody in your team can use. And interestingly enough, we're seeing the transition away from code into low code, meaning developers nowadays want to get started with very, very little amount of boilerplate. And this is going to be a key theme during this presentation. So one of the key insights here is if you can write tests in very, very little amounts of code, or even no code at all, that's going to yield the best results. And interestingly enough, the other really big trend that we're seeing is a shift away from backend into front end. And the reason for this really has to do a lot with the user and where the user is, right? So when I think about giving a product, a website, or web app to the user, I'm not giving them a backend, I'm giving them a front end. And I'll get in a little bit into why that matters, but one of the key principles is that instead of focusing on abstraction, we can focus on interaction. This applied to the world of testing is really, really relevant, right? Because we really don't test abstractions when we test with end-to-end testing, browser simulated testing. We focus all about being sympathetic to that end user. And this is what the Vercel sort of philosophy is all about. And to underline this as well, most backends are not interesting because you don't have to write them from scratch anymore. So when you think about creating a modern blog today, you don't write the backend for it, you write the front end. And the backend itself could be something that you could acquire as an API, like for example with Contentful and Sanity and Strappy and all these amazing headless CMSs. Persistence is being turned into a backend as a service form with Fauna or Firebase or MongoDB Atlas and many others. Authentication as well. You don't need to write an auth backend. You can basically buy it or rent it. A real-time communication infrastructure, even though I created Socket.io years ago, today I would reach for something that provides it to me as a service so I don't have to run it and maintain it. You can think of payments, search, any backend that was interesting to write has probably been turned into a robust software as a service form. And we're also seeing industry-wide trends moving away from this idea of, write the full stack, which was kind of the thinking with Django and Rails, into, well, what about I focus more on this amazing interaction and capability that JavaScript has on the client instead. So that's why we see the rise of React and Vue. And obviously the trends are pretty clear in this. When you think about what are the skills that people are teaching themselves today, they're reaching more for these front-end first frameworks. And the whole hypothesis here is that the shift that we're seeing is impacting the entire software lifecycle. So I'm going to walk you through really quickly how we're seeing that this shift will impact education and training, development and debugging, design process, deployment, And most importantly to us, the interplay between deployment and automated testing, as well as later on we can get into how we can also de-risk by launching experiments into with our products that might or might not be enabled for everybody. So when you think about those trends that I just talked about with Ruby on Rails and Django, and how we're seeing the rise of front and first frameworks, one way of looking at that is that education is beginning with the front end. In a lot of cases, beginning inside the browser. So you see coding schools gravitating towards teaching these skills. So Stanford CS 101 teaches JavaScript, which any browser comes with an IDE for, or modern hacker schools are teaching you how to become proficient with React and start contributing immediately. Interestingly enough, the IDEs that can be built inside the browser are so powerful, and all of these, like Code Sandbox and REPL and Glitch, are native ways of learning and hacking on the same technology. So it's a richer fitting. And interestingly as well, tutorials can benefit from being very interactive when you're teaching front-end technologies, because you're manipulating the front end directly as you're learning. So we're seeing this with the rise of tutorials that validate your input and allow you to modify the front end directly and so on. When it comes down to development and debugging, perhaps we're seeing the most dramatic shifts. So when I spoke of why Next.js has grown so quickly, one of the key things has been this focus on low code, as well as the ability to manipulate this front end directly in real time. So what you're watching here as a video is essentially the creation of an entire app with as little code really as it takes. We're creating a clone of Hacker News. And the developer in this case is just entirely focusing on how the product works, what it looks like, what components it uses. And in this case, actually, we're creating the components from scratch. But as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing the rise of more broadly and universally reusable quote unquote Lego bricks for building this front end. So what's interesting here is we're seeing browser and code editor in perfect real-time synchrony, thanks to Next.js's hot module replacement technology. But we're also seeing the creation of a front end that queries the backend, in this case, a Hacker News API, just in a matter of seconds. And as I mentioned, this process is so powerful, this idea of direct manipulation of content on the browser, that we're even seeing design and development merge and become focused on the front end. So one of my favorite technologies in this realm is Tailwind, which allows me to basically be a proficient designer with low code, so small amounts of code, and I'm manipulating the environment directly. So I'm testing as close to the user as possible, okay? So like this is one of the key insights that we're gonna keep coming back to is how can you be as empathetic to the end result as possible? How can you be empathetic to your end user as possible? How you can be empathetic to the end result as possible? And when it comes to design, one of the ways of doing this is to develop and design directly in the medium that we're gonna use to serve our users. So CSS is a great technology for this. Another example is the rise of component libraries like GitHub's Primer and so many others around the web. And obviously, we are in the business of facilitating deployment. And I think this is where these ideas start to really shine and come together compared to other platforms like native development. So when you think about a modern front-end developer, their expectations about how the world works are what I just showed you. So they're about manipulating the medium and the result in real time. So when you think about a front-end developer, the least interesting thing to them would be infrastructure, would be YAML, would be configuring Let's Encrypt, would be configuring low-level cloud infrastructure, would be configuring web servers. A front-end developer that is rising in this new world is thinking about completely different things. They're thinking about features, aesthetics, customer journeys, animations, performance, lighthouse optimization, all kinds of things that are about that developing that feedback with the customer and also receiving feedback very, very quickly. So when you think about legacy cloud infrastructure, it's the opposite of receiving feedback very quickly because it involves all this slow provisioning of resources. And this is where Vercel comes in to facilitate that feedback loop. And it's aided by two underlying important trends that have been happening on the web for the past few years that are shifting the cloud toward the front end. So one of them is the rise of Jamstack. Jamstack, in a nutshell, is the combination of JavaScript on the client for interaction, APIs as a service, as I mentioned earlier, for backends, whether you wrote those backends or whether you are using them from a service like Algolia or Stripe or some headless CMS. And then the combination of markup, meaning just using HTML as a powerful primitive for speeding up content delivery from the edge. So interestingly enough, we're seeing that this new stack that's being born for front-end focused applications takes advantage of static assets that can be automatically deployed to a CDN and serverless primitives like functions for the development of APIs and more dynamic front ends. So really what's happening as a result is that every primitive that a front-end developer needs today is fully serverless, right? So the JavaScript and the markup, which make up the bare skeleton or fundamental building blocks of your application, are entirely serverless, right? Because we can deploy them to a CDN. And there's no management that I need to do as a front-end developer once I publish my assets to a CDN. And when it comes to the APIs, whether I wrote them myself with functions, or whether I'm using something like Twilio or a headless CMS or Firebase or whatever, there's no management for me to do. So this is a very empowering stack because as a front developer, I'm focused on the product, but my stack requires absolutely no management monitoring whatsoever. And we're starting to see that this stack is taking over the web, right? So like there's probably two types of people in this audience. The ones that spend a lot of time on LinkedIn and the ones that spend a lot of time on Twitter. And what's interesting about these two apps that we spend a lot of time on is that they're both built with this front-end first mindset. And an easy way to identify this is that when you first come to them, you'll notice that there is no server involved. They both first ship a skeleton of the application. These are projects themselves that have been entirely started by front-end teams at these companies that took over the .coms of these two major websites and displaced the old way of doing, stateful, serverful application development. So really what this shows you is this movement is a reality even at the largest properties on the web. And I think perhaps the most interesting trend that comes with this is that if we're focusing on the front end, the idea of the code review, while still incredibly relevant and it's not going to disappear, can really give rise to instead focusing on the end result, which is what we call the deploy preview. So the code review phase, typically for infrastructure code or backend code and so on, there's nothing that we could possibly see, right? So like we have to focus on the diff. However, if I'm focusing on UI or I'm focusing on a front end, I can instead focus on the preview of that front end. So this shift, I think, will be the most dramatic of all, right? Because it changes the workflow and it changes how teams reason about the world and build their products. Because it's not that they're going to dismiss code, but it's not going to be as big of a priority as it is to actually make sure that the product works to the highest level of expectation. And I think for those in the audience that are spend a lot of time on QA and testing, they probably tend to frown upon code a little bit because code can create more problems sometimes than it solves. So that's why I'm particularly excited about focusing on the end result as my biggest priority. And the way that this works with Vercel is that what happens is that for every PR, you get a hyperlink that you can see on the left. A bot gets activated and immediately a deploy URL is given for that particular commit, meaning that you can focus first of all, before you even go to the code diff, on launching that URL in a web browser and beginning the testing process. So what happens as a result is that the deployment process, and why is this possible, right? Like, why is it possible to create all these URLs for every push, every PR, every branch? And really is that the shift towards serverless, the shift towards the static, the shift towards Jamstack, the shift towards front-end frameworks is allowing us to create dramatic optimizations on the deployment pipeline. Things that weren't possible with Kubernetes containers or Heroku, like deploying every single version of your application, are now cheap and cost effective. So it's fast to deploy. There's no configuration needed. Every URL is HTTPS ready. It's also really fast to serve because every URL is deployed from the edge and served from the edge, global in nature. So all these URLs are fast everywhere in the world, and have this idea of secure by default. And it's kind of, again, started to shift this mindset into focus your testing on local hosts, focus your testing on artificial unit tests. We're shifting this mindset towards testing with that URL that is production-like. So last year, I kind of tweeted this a little bit in jest, but also a little bit seriously, which is that we can really focus on end-to-end, right? Like, this is how we trust that a product works. And this is kind of the core idea here. The deployment becomes the center of gravity. So that URL that you get when you push is the one that allows us to immediately launch end-to-end tests, to get the largest amount of confidence, launch screenshot diffs with Percy and BrowserStack, for example. If it's an API, we can very quickly make assertions about the shapes of JSON, for example, or validate that the API responses are correct. We can launch performance tests to ensure that performance is not regressing. And again, we're deploying in the production-like infrastructure that will serve your product as well, your end result, right? So you're getting HTTPS, you're getting edge performance, you're getting CDN caching, you're getting all the things that will give you a really good idea of whether a product is performing or not. Obviously, with BrowserStack, we can focus on cross-browser testing. We can do user testing, where we take a URL and we expose it to different groups of users in a controlled fashion. We can get product feedback as a result from them early on. We can get product feedback from users. We can get product feedback from different job functions within the company. And we can do manual QA, which obviously I think is a big part for lots and lots of businesses in creating great products and not regressing. So the way that it looks like is, for example, when you use Vercel in combination with GitHub, is that you get a check that signifies the deployment. So you can see there, Vercel is the check. Say, okay, deployment has completed. When you install Vercel, we unify the build process and the publishing process. So you can think of Vercel here as a substitute for Circle CI and for, Firebase hosting, for example. So it's an all-in-one solution for building and publishing your project. And then we can start launching different tests. So for example, Percy by BrowserStack can do screenshot diffing right away. In parallel, I can assert the shapes of responses and that certain strings are present in payloads, which, unlike other forms of testing, can be a very, very quick assurance that everything is going in the right direction. I can do cross-browser testing. I can do end-to-end testing in parallel. And this is a growing ecosystem of applications that are point and click to install on GitHub, right? So like, I installed Vercel, and then I installed all the applications that surround it that'll give me testing capabilities. So without further ado, and without talking too much, I'm going to show how this actually works, especially from the perspective of someone that has never used this platform before. So what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to create a project using Next.js because it's my favorite framework, but obviously this will work for any framework or application that you want to use. So I'm going to call it my BrowserStack conference demo. So if you're familiar with the Node ecosystem, you'll know that obviously there are a few million dependencies to download, but it should be very quickly. Okay, so I'm here on my project. It's a very simple Next.js project. It has a build process and a development process. But instead of launching a server, I'm going to deploy to the Vercel serverless infrastructure. So I'm going to publish it to global CDN instead of running a server myself, which I don't want to do because in this case, I'm acting as a front-end developer. So I'm going to create a repo really quick to show you the entire end-to-end process. I'm going to go to GitHub, and I'm going to create a repo. So I'm going to make my first commit. I believe I can copy this. Okay, so now I have my repository with my application. Obviously, this is a new application, but you can try this later with your own applications. But so this is kind of the first dichotomy that happens to anyone that wants to test a product, right? Like, where's the URL to run this? How can I actually use this thing? It's, as far as I'm concerned, this is dead code. This is an illusion of something working. So what is the quickest way in the universe to bring this project into reality? Namely, to import it into the world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the URL of my repository here, and I'm going to import it into Vercel. So I already have an account, but obviously you can create your own. I'm going to create import project. I'm going to import from the Git repository, and I'm going to add my BrowserStack conference demo. So notice that it detected automatically that I have Next.js. But a bunch of other frameworks are supported out of the box, and they will be auto-detected. And if you don't want to use a framework, or you want to write your own framework, you can customize things like the build command and the output directory, as well as for more sophisticated projects involve environmental variables. So I'm going to deploy my project, and you're going to see that immediately it goes into our build pipeline. As I mentioned earlier, every project we take care of building. And because we take care of building, we can perform really amazing optimizations during this phase. For example, Next.js is able to pre-render a lot of your pages, meaning that it's able to merge data that comes, for example, from a headless CMS or from other kinds of APIs that you might have. And it can do, it can already begin optimizing those. So it can already be producing HTML for those. It can, as you're seeing here, it can do code splitting. It can optimize JavaScript. It can optimize CSS. So this is a production-ready project. I'm going to click Visit, and it's going to open my production URL for it, which is my BrowserStack conference demo.vercel.app. And for a moment now, I'm going to go into the dashboard to show you that, okay, I have my production deployment. Obviously, I made only one deployment. You can see the logs here again. You can see what branch it came from, which in this case is master from GitHub. So now this project, which before was only limited to just code, now receives a working URL. But what's interesting about this process is not just that I get a URL at this given time for the master branch. What's interesting is that I can create a branch. So I'm going to create my demo branch. So when I create my demo branch, I can now change some text and say, welcome to our live stream. So I'm going to commit again and say, I am testing this integration. So Git is now going to suggest that I create my branch. Okay, so typically, again, if we think about the testing process here, what would happen is that this will be just limited to a PR, right? And the team will, we can argue that they will test in their minds, right? Because they will focus on reading and writing code. So I'm going to go and I'm going to say, oh, like this looks good. This makes sense to me, especially as like code diffs get larger. The more complexity that and more burden that exists on the reviewer side. But no, that's not going to happen in our case because we use Vercel. So Vercel will go ahead and begin deploying this as well. So notice that even while I'm talking here, I already completed that build process, but I'm just going to show you to you for entertainment reasons. It was able to build. Notice that actually it was able to resume the cache from the previous build automatically. I configured absolutely nothing here. And I get my production ready. And this, I want to stress this because this build is performing all the production optimizations that you would expect out of the .com of your product, right? Out of the end result of your product. And what happens is, even before I would have read any code, I can actually focus on that preview URL that we talked about. But here's the most interesting thing here is that with this URL, I can not only do manual QA, I can launch integrations against it. As I mentioned earlier, you can configure checks that in addition to the deploy being built correctly, which already gives you a great deal of assurance, right? Because, okay, it built, it works, I can access it. That already gives you a ton more confidence than a PR. We can install checks that bring that confidence to the next level. And when it comes down to iterating on products, the entire team gets a lot more confident. Now, let's say that I like this change. Welcome to our live stream. What I'm going to do is I'm going to merge it. So let's consider again, I'm going to delete the branch. Let's remember that my production URL was my BrowserStack conference demo.vercel.app, right? So let's go for a minute back to my project overview here. And so this was my deploy URL. Let's visit it. So it was my BrowserStack conference demo.vercel.app. So let me remove this for a little bit. I'm going to go to my canonical production URL. Like it could be, this could have been my .com, for example, and you're going to see that now my change is live. So this kind of gives you a quick overview of how the product actually works, so that you can see that it's very quick and real. And you can notice that we give you all these .vercel.app URLs. We give you one that represents production, which you can also configure a custom domain for, obviously. But we also give you a URL that represents every push, every commit, and every branch. And this really gives rise to this really rich ecosystem of integrations, right? So we gain the ability to now defer the execution of arbitrary actions against that URL. So a great example would be Percy can now access that URL and perform screenshot diffing, so that I can make sure that, before I merge my PR, everything works well from the perspective of an end user in a very realistic fashion. And beyond automated testing, I think one of the things that I'm excited about in the future is that another way of de-risking is not just to assume that we're going to be perfect with all this testing and QI integration. Sometimes things slip through because we didn't write a test or because we got a false positive. So the other thing that deploy preview URLs will give you is the ability to experiment. Instead of merging to go live, as we just did directly, we can indicate to avoid all kinds of problems. Obviously revert, right? So like something went wrong, we revert, and that'll be very quick as well. So when I just showed you that change that I made, welcome to our live stream, I could have also reverted it very, very quickly. And in fact, Vercel has optimizations to not rebuild unless necessary. So fixing something live is very quick. But again, it shouldn't be an all or nothing thing, right? So you can think of your production branch as something that can also be a live experiment. And this is a capability that's coming soon for the Vercel platform, where a domain can represent a variant of two different deployments that get a different amount of traffic each. So this is another way of quote unquote testing in production. And finally, another way that is very much also rooted in real world testing is monitoring the error rates that could be associated with a deploy and automatically adjusting the status of that deployment. So for example, downscaling an experiment or altogether getting rid of it, or altogether reverting a master branch, for example. So this just shows you how this idea of a live deployment that can constantly change gives a tremendous amount of leverage when it comes to iterating with confidence. And I think that's the most exciting thing that Vercel is giving all these companies in production today. We're giving them the ability to gain more confidence and stay more motivated to make changes, really. There's no fear that arises from working on your product. And you can piggyback on the best integrations in the marketplace, like Percy does for screenshot testing, such that your product evolves with more and more confidence every day. That's it for today. To get started, the easiest way is to obviously import your project as I showed, but you can go to vercel.com, start deploying, select a Git repository, or if you really want to test it quick, start from a template. So you can select a Next.js app, a Gatsby app, and so on.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Guillermo. Great introduction to serverless and how we can make deployment and testing very easy with live URLs. So we've got quite a few questions. I think some of them you've been addressing during the chat. Let me see if I can go through some of these. Okay, so one question is around module and component, sort of what you talked about in your presentation about building components versus templates. How do you manage security and like how do you prevent things like module bloat, where you've got like an explosion of modules being built out?
Great question. So on one hand, we're really big believers that this new shift toward front end as separated from back end will be a massive win for security in general. It's almost like you're secure by default, right? Because you're serving data. You're not serving data, you're serving the primitives to acquire and run data. And that small distinction makes it such that, for example, you can enable the usage of new technologies on the client side, like end-to-end encryption, right? Like instead of delivering a bunch of user-specific data embedded in the HTML, you can serve the app that then uses JavaScript on the client side to then retrieve the data, makes for a more secure application profile. And we see this kind of across the board with obviously static sites and static apps is the default more secure behavior because you're giving the same access to everybody, kind of like how iPhone applications work, right? Like you're basically downloading the app, then you make an API call on the client side. So to reason about the security of a modern front-end application is way easier, less surface of attack, etc. When it comes down to the other side of the question, which is how do you prevent module bloat? That's a really fascinating question. So there are multiple dimensions to attack that problem. One is Next.js as a framework. If you choose Next.js, we do a lot of optimizations for reducing the amount of JS that we serve to the client. So one of the things that Google contributed to Next.js is what we call the no module or module script optimization. And basically it's just a fancy word for saying, if you're accessing from iPhone, we give you JS optimized for iPhone. if you access from Chrome, we give you JS optimized for Chrome, so that we don't have to ship polyfills and like JS modules that are not really needed on the client side. So we continue to invest a lot in the framework being an intelligent layer, such that it only gives the client the least amount of code and modules that it needs. But the other way of ensuring, because really what the person is asking is not really like module bloat for the sake of module bloat. I think they're also worrying about performance, right? Security and performance. So for the performance side, something I'm a really big fan of is that you can take any of our preview URLs and you can run lighthouse tests, for example, against them. And that means you can actually understand if you're becoming slower or faster over time. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Eval. So, okay, a couple questions around security. Since you are deploying URLs sort of into the internet, and you talked about URLs are all secure SSL enabled, but how do I control access and restrict access to those URLs to just a specific set of people?
Great question.
Within a specific network?
Yeah, so you can do it on 2 layers. On the platform layer, you can protect them with SSO. For example, only people in your team can access the preview version. The production version can actually also be protected, but normally production is, yourcompany.com. So that one typically is unprotected. And then you can have the option to even password protect all the preview URLs. But then another interesting thing is that you can do another layer of protection, as I mentioned earlier, on the client side, right? So like you can make it so that your API requires authorization to perform different actions, right? So in the case of our own application, in order to see my dashboard, I had to sign in with GitHub. So you can do several phases of protection, some that could live in your application layer, or some that can live at the edge, basically.
Got it. All right. Another question around, I think, support for Gatsby. So do we support incremental builds, support Gatsby
Yes.
incremental builds?
In fact, we're the fastest provider for Gatsby incremental builds on the market today. And really, this is why I spent time on explaining how the platform is all about being versatile. And the platform is about capturing the new trends in software development. Even though we developed Next.js and we love it, we let developers even configure and bring their own frameworks. So Gatsby, we have excellent support out of the box, and we auto-detect it and we auto-optimize it. But you can also, because Vercel, the Vercel CLI and the Vercel pipeline is fully open source, you can go and edit on GitHub. For example, let's say you create a new framework called Praveen.js, and you want Vercel to auto-detect it for other people that might deploy it and auto-optimize it. You can write bindings for that as well. And we just merge them as a PR. And the beauty of that is that any app really that is dealing with HTML, JS, CSS, etc., even images, can be built and optimized and served by this platform.
Good. Okay. Fair. What about if I am already using an existing infrastructure provider like AWS for my apps? How would Vercel work in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so typically what we see is that people use AWS in a region-centric way, right? Like when people move from something like AWS to us, they're moving away also from software development practices that they want to leave behind. So for example, a PHP monolith running in a container in AWS, right? So we don't run those kinds of apps, right? We only serve modern front. And so an easy way to for teams to transition to something that's faster, like Vercel, is they can retain their backend workloads in AWS, and then they can modernize their front end on Vercel. And typically what that allows them to do is that they don't need to reinvent the wheel, which is nice. They can still retain the control and security model of their backend, which typically is the thing that deals with data, right? So typically teams are more protective of that. So they can retain the control of that. But then think of it as like you're hoisting out of that
region, you're liberating the front end and you're replicating it across the world. So typically teams are not interested in self-hosting this kind of infrastructure, right? Like you don't, most teams don't want to create and run their own CDNs. So the best thing to do there is just take that thing that you can speed up when it's liberated from your cluster, your Kubernetes, and a nice advantage of doing this as well is not just performance or like less DevOps and so on, but it's also cost, right? Like a lot of people that I talk to are running front-end workloads as, for example, an Nginx server serving static files inside a cluster. Like, you don't have to do that anymore. You can literally delete all that. You can delete Varnish, you can delete Redis, you can delete a lot of web servers, and you can push it to the edge. But you can retain things like APIs, databases, etc. Those probably are better off, in your cluster, and you don't want to also reinvent the wheel.
Got it. Okay, I think there's a question around deploying to multiple URLs, like a staging and maybe a development URL with Vercel, maintaining separate environments.
Yeah, so each branch automatically gets a canonical preview URL. So for example, imagine that you have a QA branch. In the example that they created BrowserStack, it would have been BrowserStack conference-get-qa.vercel.app. So that would be your like canonical QA branch. A nice workflow that we see customers do is they have a production branch that's not their default branch in Git. So like their default branch would be staging or QA. And then you can configure a custom domain just for that branch. So you can say, I don't want to use a .vercel.app URL. I want to call this stagingproduct.com. And then every time you merge to that branch, Vercel will automatically push to that domain. And then, and by the way, this is a great way also of adopting the product even partially, right? Like you could just use Vercel if you want for staging. But then you can configure your master branch or your main branch for production and assign a different domain to that. So when you say, okay, I'm done with QA, I'm going to merge my QA branch into my main branch, then you'll go live. And as I mentioned briefly in the presentation, if anything went wrong, you can revert that PR and Vercel will automatically reutilize the assets that we built for the previous main deployment. So even if your QA isn't perfect, which obviously for all our QA audience, I'm sure you are, but other people that are, slip during the QA process, the company can still de-risk by reverting very quickly.
Great, awesome. I think we're out of time, Guillermo, but thanks a lot for a very, very interesting talk on sort of the future and moving to front end and serverless. Definitely looks like a much more pain-free way to deploy apps and build apps. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us.
If anyone wants to, and if anyone wants to reach out to me with more questions, my DMs are open on Twitter. So it's twitter.com/RauchG, RauchG. Just feel free to DM me with questions or feedback about the presentation, and we'll try to make it better in the future.
Awesome. Great. Thanks a lot, Guillermo. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.